Chapter 8. Visiting a mental institution is to take a trip into another world. My admission took place before state policies of deinstitutionalisation had closed the big hospitals down, and Ngāwhatu Hospital was its own little town. It housed short and long stay psychiatric wards, as well as villas for intellectually disabled people, from the mildly to the severely incapacitated. Many of the people in those categories had lived there all or most of their lives. The grounds were extensive. There was a shop, chapel, heated indoor swimming pool, gymnasium, bowling green, tennis courts, woodworking shops, vegetable gardens, and a working farm. I was to spend the next 10 weeks in Rata Villa, which was the short-stay acute psychiatric ward, home to those requiring temporary crisis care and respite. The people who didn't go home from Rata ended up living semi-permanently in the next villa up, a useful threat for psychiatrists to make to unruly patients who were annoying them. What did I know about mental institutions? Well, I pretty much harboured the same fears and prejudices that most people do. I, like most of the population, had never imagined for 1 minute that I would ever end up in a loony bin. I'd never even visited one. But here I was. And I was to discover that mental illness is the great leveller. There were people in Rata from all walks of life, and the one thing we had in common was exactly that belief, that none of us ever thought that our lives would go so awry as to lead us here. Rita had gone ahead in her car, and Mum drove me over to Ngāwhatu. Once I'd completed the admission procedure with one of the doctors, which is basically a series of questions designed to evaluate your mental status, we were taken through to the ward. In my favour, the first patient I saw there was a woman I knew from my addiction recovery meetings. This was a good sign. I'd met her a few times and liked her, and hadn't noticed anything particularly weird about her. It was afternoon tea time on the ward, and there was a trolley in the large lounge area stacked with tea, coffee and biscuits, also not a bad sign. People came and went from the lounge, and Mum and I sat there taking it all in, this huge and bewildering experience. Being a psychiatric hospital, though, it didn't take long for things to get a little odd. That much we were expecting. So far, it had seemed stranger that there was something oddly comforting and normalising about the place. That reverie was quickly broken by the entry into the room of a brash, red-headed young man who loudly announced himself as King David. He immediately spied Irene, an elegant-looking woman in her 80s that Mum had met before. Irene was floating around the ward with her handbag stuck firmly under her arm. King David started trying to take the handbag from her. She retaliated by gracefully pouring the contents of the milk jug over his head. Welcome to the bin. Mum and I just looked at each other, and for the first time in a long while we cracked up laughing. Yes, it was obvious I was about to embark on a strange voyage with some strange fellow voyagers, and we just hoped it was going to work. Saying goodbye to Mum after the admission felt daunting, and I don't imagine she felt great about it either. Visiting with her was one thing, not going home with her after the cup of tea was entirely another. My best efforts had brought me to this. Little did I know that I was going to make some enduring friendships through my time in Rata. I discovered that down in the abyss of loneliness, fear, and abnormal grief dwelt others who really knew what it felt like to be there. Being in Rata was like being in a life raft together, and as survivors of our own shipwrecks, we shared bonds and an unspoken comprehension of each other that will always stand. Getting started on medication was a huge relief. One of the best things about mental hospital was the sleeping pills. I had not had a proper night's sleep in over a year. I could finally accept that my ways of dealing with the insanity had not worked at all. I was ready to just shut up and take the medicine. I was started immediately on the new wonder drug, the antidepressant Prozac, which at that time was a hopeful new development in psychiatry. I was on enough to cure an all black, as my psychiatrist was fond of saying. Supplementing this, I was prescribed anti-anxiety medication in the form of clonazepam, which, like Valium, is a member of the benzodiazepine family. An antipsychotic drug called Maloril, or thiazidine, which, when taken, is akin to having someone hit you round the head with a plank, and of course the sleeping tablets, temazepam, also a benzodiazepine. They looked like little green footballs and were highly prized by the patients. I learned quickly that a whole new drug culture previously unknown to me existed in here. Once you'd paid the price of the entry with your sanity to become a member of this exclusive club, there were complimentary drugs all round. The diagnosis assigned to me was depression with psychosis. The depression portion rather tamely accounted for the immense and compounding emotions of grief, loss and despair that had taken over me since my relationship breakup and the recollections of childhood sexual abuse. The psychosis part pertained to the chaotic and hallucinatory audio, visual and belief system disturbances I was experiencing. This covered everything from my belief that the clues and letters in the television program Wheel of Fortune were delivering important messages to me, to the alarming, disembodied and distracting voice in my head that kept telling me there was trouble, doom, and that Satan had me and I must die. The psychiatrist also acknowledged my prior addiction to cannabis, for which I was still abstinent, so this didn't require much attention during this stay. It was, however, to be the great unraveller of my new and fragile stability a few months down the track. I don't know whether the psychiatrist formally recorded me as suffering the effects of post-traumatic stress disorder, but if I'd been the doctor I would have put this on the list too. As a diagnosis at this time it was not commonly used and understood outside its application to war veterans. However, it is now recognised as a legitimate response, especially to childhood trauma, capable of causing all of those symptoms I had been experiencing and more. Nightmares, waking up yelling, the hypervigilance, the overactive fight or flight response, panic attacks, and the breakdown of normal functioning mimic the shell shock that doctors observe in returned soldiers. Diagnoses are important because of the weight they carry in determining a treatment path, but psychiatry can be a notoriously murky discipline, with the human mind refusing to be constrained by tick boxes and clear-cut definitions. A diagnosis once given can change and evolve over time, both in an individual's presentation and in terms of what is scientifically known about the mind. My diagnosis more or less covered how I was feeling at that time, and I marvelled yet again at this strange little psychiatric world where people understood this stuff and treated it seriously. I felt like I'd been making myself hoarse trying to get people to understand how I felt this past year. Neither my family nor I will ever really understand why it was so hard to access help, given that this whole branch of medicine exists for the diagnosis and treatment of exactly such ills as I had described. It seemed that the mental health services existed behind a veil, hidden from society's view. But now I had finally passed through that veil, and at least somebody had a plan. And God, was it a boring one. The plan appeared to consist mainly of taking the medication and then sitting around for a few weeks waiting for it to kick in. Some of us sat, some of us paced, and most of us smoked cigarettes. Smoked and smoked and smoked. We were all waiting, and the term patient seemed very appropriate. My mood refused to budge. The acute depression and anxiety held fast for several weeks. I continued to have panic attacks and weird physical sensations, especially in my head, and pseudo-chest pain and intense feelings of doom that caused me to fear that I must be dying. But other aspects of the treatment gave immediate relief, especially getting some sleep and having the edge taken off the anxiety. I felt like my fried-out nervous system was finally getting a break. I never could understand, though, how the sleeping pills delivered you this luxurious sleep, but then you'd be harshly wakened all too soon at 7 a.m. by the nurses getting everyone up for breakfast. If you weren't on time, you'd miss out. Even though, after breakfast, there was usually nothing to do until lunchtime, I would say, "Can't I just sleep? Just let me stay here and sleep." That's all I wanted to do, which I guess is why they went to so much effort to get us up, otherwise nobody would ever turn up for breakfast. Even now, sleep is still the most precious of all the healing tools, and if I can't sleep, this is a key indicator that all is not well. Breakfast was a good meal, though. It was to my advantage that I quite liked hospital food, especially because I didn't have to cook it. And I didn't have to stick to any of my funny diets either, as you got whatever was being dished up. I was particularly fond of the triangles of white bread toast and marmalade. Meal times are a huge deal in institutions. They are the focal point of the day. Well, that and the drug rounds, anyway.